Welcome to Sleepy History Tales. Before we begin tonight's chilling descent into the forgotten corners of American history, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Are you nestled in a foggy New England town, sitting in a creaky old house with stories of its own? Drop your location in the comments. We love seeing how far these tales travel in our brotherhood of mystery seekers. And now, settle in. Because what you're about to hear will leave a cold echo in the back of your mind. In the winter of 1879, a team of contractors arrived to renovate a long-abandoned building on Prospect Avenue in Hartford, Connecticut. It had once been a Christian home for the elderly, known as Sunset Years. But what they found beneath the rotting floorboards of the old medical wing would cast a permanent shadow over the city. Buried under layers of dust and decay, wrapped in moth-eaten burial shrouds, were 23 leather-bound ledger's records so meticulous, so horrifying, that investigators would later call them the most detailed archive of murder in New England history. Each page was a clinical ledger of death listing names, dates, causes, and most disturbingly, the profits. The ledgers revealed a staggering truth. Dr. William Porter, his wife Margaret, and her sister Sarah had operated this Christian home for 34 years, and during that time, they had methodically murdered 189 residents while stealing over $3 million in inheritances. But the horror wasn't just in the body count. It was in the cold, calculated joy with which the Porters documented every step of their crimes, like twisted accountants tallying up blessings. The full details were suppressed by Hartford authorities for nearly a century. Why? Because the truth would have shattered public trust in Christian charity. These murders weren't the work of outsiders or madmen. They were committed by caretakers trusted with guiding souls toward peace. But before we continue deeper into the house of horrors that was the Sunset Years Christian home, I need to tell you something important. This channel, Sleepy History Tales, isn't for everyone. It's for the few, the rare souls who don't look away when history turns ugly. The ones who know that beneath the surface of even the holiest institutions, the darkest secrets often lie. If you're still watching, you're one of us, a seeker, a keeper of stories too dangerous for the history books. So go ahead, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and tell us in the comments. What city or state are you watching from? We want to know how far this tale travels through the night. Now let's return to Hartford in the 1840s, a city on the edge of transformation. Caught between its strict Puritan past and an industrial future, Hartford sat at a crossroads. The Connecticut River was bringing new prosperity through shipping and manufacturing, but it also brought a new kind of crisis wealthy elderly citizens left behind as their children chased fortunes out west. The old family-centered values of Puritan New England were dissolving. The young had moved on, and the elderly. They were left alone with fortune but no heirs. The Congregationalist churches that once formed the moral spine of the city now faced a growing dilemma: how to care for a generation of isolated, aging parishioners. Into this spiritual and social void stepped Dr. William Porter in 1845, a man who seemed heaven sent. He was tall, silver-haired, and bore eyes the color of cold fire blue, piercing intelligent. Trained in medicine at Yale, he had served as a field surgeon during the Mexican-American War. He had seen both healing and death up close. His wife, Margaret, was no less impressive, a skilled nurse who had served in Boston's charity hospitals. And rounding out the trio was Margaret's sister Sarah, a stern, devout woman who had turned to Christian service after losing her husband to typhoid fever. Together, they opened the Sunset Years Christian Home, a sprawling Victorian mansion converted from a failed boarding house. It sat on 2 acres of pristine gardens, complete with a small chapel where residents could attend daily prayers. But this was no ordinary elder care facility. No, the Porters advertised it as something more, a sacred retreat, a sanctuary where the elderly elite of Hartford could spend their final years in peace, surrounded by godly hands and spiritually prepared for the journey to eternity. And the city believed them. Their reputation grew quickly through the tight-knit Congregationalist community. Reverend Samuel Whitmore, pastor of the First Church of Christ, frequently referred his struggling parishioners to the Porters, those grappling with the burden of aging parents and no means to care for them. The price of peace at the Sunset Years Christian Home didn't come cheap. At $200 per month, the cost far exceeded what most working families made in an entire year. But for Hartford's merchant elite, it seemed a small investment for dignity care and the assurance that their final days would be passed in grace, not shame. What made the Sunset Years Home especially appealing wasn't just the serenity of its gardens or the charm of its caretakers. It was the Porters' willingness to accept residents regardless of their mental condition. While other institutions quietly turned away, the confused, the forgetful, and the mentally fragile, the Porters embraced them. Dr. Porter boasted of revolutionary treatments, a divine fusion of Christian prayer and modern medicine. According to him, spiritual care was just as vital as physical treatment when confronting the slow unraveling of the mind. The daily routine at Sunset Years reflected this philosophy. Residents awoke each morning at 6:00 a.m. for chapel prayers. Breakfast followed in the communal dining hall. Dr. Porter conducted morning rounds. Margaret oversaw the nursing staff, and Sarah, ever meticulous, handled the home's financial records. Afternoons were filled with Bible study, quiet letter writing, and strolls through the garden paths. And every evening concluded with solemn prayers and whispered hymns before the residents retired to their private rooms by 9:00 p.m. From the outside, the Sunset Years Home appeared flawless, a Christian sanctuary of compassion and tranquility. Visitors praised its sparkling cleanliness, the apparent devotion of the staff, and the peaceful smiles of the elderly residents. But what they couldn't see was the intentional performance, the practiced grace behind every prayer, the chilling calculation masked as charity, because the Porters had never set out simply to care for the elderly. They had designed the perfect trap, a place where wealthy, isolated individuals could be slowly, silently, and efficiently eliminated, with no one to question their disappearance, and no one left to mourn them. The first sign that something was wrong came on a frigid morning in February 1847, though no one would grasp its true meaning for decades. Her name was Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a 73-year-old widow whose late husband had amassed a fortune in shipping. She had only lived at the home for 3 weeks. According to her intake records, she was in excellent health, lonely, yes, and troubled by arthritis, but nothing that raised concern. Her daughter lived far away in California, and her only son had died in a carriage accident the year before. She was in every way that mattered completely alone, and her estate worth nearly $50,000. She had chosen the Sunset Years Christian home because of its reputation for Christian mercy, for expert care for love where family had vanished. But on that bitter February morning, Margaret Porter found Mrs. Thornton barely conscious, mumbling incoherently about angels waiting outside her door. Her pupils were dilated. Her breath was shallow. She didn't seem to recognize anyone. She looked possessed, as one nurse later recalled. Dr. Porter was summoned immediately. After a short examination, he declared she was suffering from a sudden mental collapse, a condition he claimed to have witnessed often in the elderly. A natural decline, he said. Nothing to be done except show mercy. What followed became a blueprint, one they would use again and again and again. Dr. Porter prescribed a strong dose of morphine, explaining to the staff that Mrs. Thornton was clearly in spiritual and physical agony. It was, in his words, an act of Christian mercy to guide her gently toward peace. Margaret administered the injection herself. Within hours, Mrs. Thornton slipped into a coma. For 3 days, she lingered caught in the space between life and death. And during those 3 days, the Porters were picture-perfect caretakers. They sat at her bedside. They prayed over her. They whispered soothing words about the eternal rest that awaited her on the other side. To the staff and to the few visitors who asked, they were beacons of devotion, doing everything they could for a suffering, fading soul. And then quietly on the 4th day, Mrs. Abigail Thornton died in her sleep. The official cause of death: natural decline, advanced age, mental deterioration, all perfectly normal for a woman in her 70s. And since Dr. William Porter served as both the attending physician and the owner of the facility, he signed the death certificate himself. No autopsy, no inquiry, no hard questions from Hartford authorities. After all, this was a home for the elderly. Death was expected. But what happened next? That's what makes Mrs. Abigail Thornton's death truly significant. Because what followed was a masterclass in manipulation. Only days after her quiet passing, Sarah Porter, the ever-dutiful administrator, gathered the staff and shared a heart-wrenching story. She claimed that in her final moments of clarity, Mrs. Thornton had expressed overwhelming gratitude for the love and care she'd received at Sunset Years. With trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, Sarah told them that the widow had made one final request: that her estate be used to support the home's Christian mission. And then, Sarah produced a document, handwritten, dated, and witnessed by both Dr. Porter and Margaret. A last will and testament dictated by Mrs. Thornton herself. It left everything, nearly $50,000, to the Sunset Years Christian home. Except, of course, for a small sum earmarked for her daughter in California. Yes, the entire document was in Sarah's own handwriting. but she explained that Mrs. Thornton had been too frail to hold a pen and had asked her to write it on her behalf. The will was filed with Hartford's probate court, and since Mrs. Thornton had no local relatives to contest it, the matter went through unchallenged. Within weeks, the Porters had liquidated her assets. The money was used to expand the facility, hire more staff, and elevate the home's reputation as a shining example of Christian charity. To any outsider, it looked like the perfect story. An elderly woman dies peacefully, surrounded by loving caretakers. In a final act of gratitude, she leaves behind a generous gift to ensure others receive the same comfort and care. It was the kind of benevolence Hartford's religious leaders celebrated, a testament to Christian compassion in action. But the truth recorded in a ledger that would lie hidden for 32 more years was far more disturbing. In Dr. Porter's cold, precise handwriting, one line stood out. Mrs. A. Thornton, morphine overdose administered February 15, 1847. Inheritance secured $47,300. Method refined for future subjects. Note: gradual introduction of morphine over several days creates appearance of natural decline. Staff suspects nothing. Community response positive. This wasn't an act of kindness. It was an execution. From the moment Mrs. Thornton set foot in the home, the Porters had targeted her. They investigated her finances, confirmed her isolation, and then began poisoning her slowly, methodically, just enough to mimic the early signs of dementia. When her mind was clouded enough that no one would question a sudden collapse, they increased the dose to lethal levels, and all the while they prayed over her. The will, that too, had been carefully staged. The Porters had studied her handwriting using letters she'd brought with her. They practiced duplicating her signature, composed a document that looked convincingly authentic, and included just enough detail to make it seem legitimate. They even researched her daughter's circumstances out west and intentionally made the bequest small, just enough to quiet suspicion, but not worth traveling cross-country to contest. But perhaps the most sinister part of their crime wasn't the forgery. It wasn't even the murder. It was the mask of mercy they wore as they did it. Wrapped in scripture and sanctimony, they created the perfect illusion. Every act of violence cloaked in the language of grace. Every fatal injection whispered over with prayer. They weren't just killers. They were killers who believed themselves righteous. Every forged document the Porters created was presented as a sacred final wish, the heartfelt offering of a grateful soul eager to support God's work even in death. And every stolen inheritance justified as a divine gift, a blessing to continue a holy mission of comfort and care. But make no mistake, the murder of Mrs. Abigail Thornton wasn't just a single act of evil. It was a revelation. The Porters had uncovered something chilling: the perfect crime. They had proven that elderly people could be murdered with total impunity so long as the poison was slow. The prayers were sincere, and the caretakers wore the mask of Christian devotion. Even more importantly, they had demonstrated that massive inheritances could be transferred without raising suspicion if the victims were alone and the killers were pillars of the religious community. Mrs. Thornton's death was not an accident. It was a prototype, Murder fully systematized. And in Dr. Porter's final note on her case, he recorded the terrifying conclusion: method proven effective. Expansion of operations recommended. The Lord has provided us with a most profitable mission. Her death marked the beginning of a carefully orchestrated reign of terror, a holy facade concealing a monstrous truth. Over the next 32 years, this profitable mission would claim 188 more lives. In the months following Mrs. Thornton's passing, subtle shifts began to take hold within the walls of Sunset Years. At first, they were barely noticeable, but soon the pattern became undeniable. Dr. Porter grew more selective in the residents he allowed through the front gates. Where once anyone who could pay the steep monthly fee was welcomed now, he demanded extensive interviews, not only with prospective residents, but with their family members as well. To the staff, he explained this was part of a new commitment to personalized care, to tailoring treatment for each soul's unique needs. But behind closed doors, something far more sinister was taking shape. The Porters had learned from Mrs. Thornton's case that success required careful planning and the right kind of victim. They now sought out individuals who were wealthy, socially isolated, vulnerable to suggestion, and most importantly, unlikely to be mourned or missed. Margaret Porter became the chief investigator of this twisted recruitment process. Using her nursing expertise, she developed a highly detailed evaluation system to assess each applicant's health, memory, life expectancy, and even their emotional resilience. She also looked at family structure, financial independence, and the presence or absence of heirs. Only those who met very specific criteria were invited to live at Sunset Years. Meanwhile, Sarah Porter took on a different role. She immersed herself in legal research, becoming a quiet expert in inheritance law and probate court procedure. Presenting herself as a meticulous administrator, she met regularly with Hartford lawyers, earning their trust, asking questions under the guise of improving resident services. Unknowingly, they gave her the very tools she needed to forge perfectly believable legal documents. And all the while, the three Porters were refining their murder methods. Dr. Porter ran secret tests with various drug combinations, recording how each one impacted his elderly patients. He discovered that morphine mixed with laudanum could create a slow mental haze that resembled dementia, and that small doses of arsenic administered gradually would lead to organ failure, easily mistaken for natural age-related decline. Margaret, with her clinical training, perfected the delivery system. She kept false medical records, carefully documenting non-existent symptoms, and made up treatment plans. Each entry justified the use of morphine, laudanum, arsenic, all administered under the pretense of comfort and healing. Her professional demeanor and legitimate credentials made every action seem routine, even compassionate. No one questioned a thing. And outside the walls of the home, the Porter family's reputation soared. Throughout the late 1840s and into the early 1850s, Sunset Years became one of the most admired institutions in Hartford. They used their stolen wealth to expand, adding a library, a music room, and more elaborate gardens. To the community, the home was a symbol of Christian benevolence and modern care. But behind every flower bed, Behind every hymn echoing from the chapel lay a truth so dark it would take decades to come to light. As their confidence and their bank accounts grew, the Porters began to expand their influence outside the walls of Sunset Years. They started hosting lavish charity events, inviting Hartford's social elite to tour the grounds, meet the staff, and witness firsthand the exceptional care being provided to the city's aging population. These events weren't just public relations. They were strategic weapons. Each gathering served multiple sinister purposes. They reinforced the Porters' image as selfless Christian caretakers. They allowed the trio to identify new potential victims, wealthy guests, whose elderly relatives might soon require care. And they created a protective web of influence, a network of respected community leaders who would later defend the home against any suspicion. One of their most vocal allies was Reverend Samuel Whitmore, pastor of the First Church of Christ. From the pulpit, he sang the Porters' praises, urging his wealthiest congregants to entrust their aging parents to Sunset Years. To him, they weren't killers. They were saints in nurses' clothing. But perhaps the most disturbing transformation during this period was one found in the Porters themselves. They were no longer just committing murder. They were enjoying it. The hidden ledgers from this time reveal a horrific truth. The Porters had started rating their victims' deaths. Each entry detailed not only the financial gain, but also the aesthetic execution of the crime. How convincing were their tears? How elegant was the method of poisoning? How seamless was the legal transition of assets? Dr. Porter even began writing performance reviews of each murder. One particularly chilling entry from 1849 documents the slow death of Colonel James Hartford, a 68-year-old Revolutionary War veteran who was poisoned with arsenic over 6 months. Dr. Porter wrote, "Subject exhibited excellent cooperation during terminal phase. Arsenic dosage created perfect simulation of natural decline. Staff performance exemplary. Margaret's tears during final moments particularly convincing. Inheritance secured 73,500. Overall rating 9/10. Note: Colonel's military pension ceases upon death factor into future calculations. They had turned murder into management, a business of death, complete with evaluations and strategy memos. Worse still, they had absolved themselves of guilt. Each killing was reframed as a sacrifice, a necessary act to fund their holy mission. Their twisted theology held that God had chosen them to provide care for the living and passage for the dying. At a price. By 1850, the Sunset Years Christian home was the pride of Hartford. The Porters had built an unshakable reputation. They were devout, generous, respected members of the community. They attended church services faithfully. They donated to local charities. They even appeared in newspaper features on Christian philanthropy. But behind the marble staircases and manicured gardens, their success was breeding new dangers. The number of deaths at Sunset Years was beginning to raise eyebrows. One man in particular was watching Dr. Samuel Harrison Hartford's coroner. He began noticing an unsettling trend. A growing number of death certificates were being signed by Dr. Porter. Too many for coincidence. Individually, the cases seemed normal, but taken together, they hinted at something darker. Harrison's suspicions deepened after a quiet conversation with Father Patrick O'Brien, a local Catholic priest. Father O'Brien had recently been contacted by several Catholic families, all of whom had experienced something strange. Their elderly relatives had died at sunset years and supposedly converted to Protestantism just before their deaths. Even more alarming, these same relatives had also rewritten their wills, directing most of their estates to the home, just like Mrs. Thornton. To Father O'Brien, this was no coincidence. It was spiritual manipulation and likely legal fraud. The implications were explosive. Not only were the Porters committing murder, they were now suspected of targeting Catholics using forced conversions and phony wills to mask their crimes. If that secret ever went public, it would spark religious outrage and unravel their empire. Dr. Harrison decided to launch a quiet investigation, but the Porter's influence ran deep. When he approached the city for support, he was dismissed. Sunset Years, he was told, was one of Hartford's most respected institutions. Any investigation would need to be handled with care, lest it damage public trust or the wrong reputations. But the Porters already knew about his interest. Their web of supporters had tipped them off. They responded quickly. They slowed the pace of their killings. They varied their methods to obscure patterns, and they cultivated Dr. Harrison, directly inviting him for guided tours of the home, showing him smiling residents, praising his dedication to public health. It worked. By 1851, the threat had passed. Dr. Harrison, like so many others, had been disarmed by charm and overwhelmed by appearances. And the murders continued. The Porters had done the impossible. They'd convinced Dr. Samuel Harrison, the city's coroner, that the staggering number of deaths at Sunset Years was not suspicious, but simply the natural result of their charity. After all, they were the only institution in Hartford willing to take in the truly frail, the unwanted, the mentally ill. City officials, already enamored with the home's public reputation, brushed aside Harrison's warnings. The Porters, they argued, were heroes. Their work irreplaceable. And just like that, the family of murderers survived their first serious challenge. But the experience left a mark. They had seen the edge of exposure, and they had no intention of letting it happen again. So they adapted. They began developing even more sophisticated layers of concealment. Falsified medical records, carefully crafted to justify each patient's death, with imaginary symptoms and progressive decline, and a growing network of corrupt or compliant officials willing to look the other way in exchange for donations, influence, or simple denial. The Porters had built an empire of deceit fortified on every front. But there was one flaw. They couldn't see the very thing that made them feel invincible. Their ledgers, hidden beneath the floorboards, these books were a record of every crime, each name, each method, each inheritance. Dr. Porter believed the ledgers were a monument to his brilliance, a sacred archive of a divine mission. But in time, they would become the very evidence that damned them. For now, though, the ledgers were still hidden. And the Porters, confident and methodical, continued their killing with unshakable certainty. To the outside world, Hartford's most revered Christian charity flourished. Behind the scenes, it was a profitable death machine run by devout executioners in white coats and Sunday clothes. But in 1853, something unexpected arrived at Sunset Years, something the Porters couldn't plan for. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. At 71 years old, she appeared to be the Porters' ideal victim. Wealthy, widowed, mentally fragile, and almost entirely alone. She had once been the wife of a prominent Boston banker, and her estate, valued at over $200,000, was by far the largest inheritance the Porters had ever set their sights on. Her only living relative was a nephew in San Francisco, a man who had visited her perhaps twice in 10 years. She had been referred to Sunset Years by her aging personal physician, Dr. Marcus Fleming, who had recently retired. To the Porters, it seemed like divine providence. They immediately initiated their standard process. Dr. Porter conducted extensive medical interviews, subtly probing into Mrs. Whitfield's financial situation. Margaret began recording invented symptoms to justify a coming decline. Sarah started researching the legal logistics for absorbing the estate. Everything was proceeding as planned until they found the letters. Mrs. Whitfield, though suffering from early-stage dementia, had developed an unusual habit. To combat her memory loss, she wrote letters to herself, daily detailed entries that documented her thoughts, activities, and surroundings. Each morning, she would reread the previous day's letter to remind herself of what had happened. At first, the Porters dismissed this as a harmless symptom, an eccentric coping mechanism. But then they started reading the letters, and what they found terrified them. One entry read, "The medicine Dr. Porter gives me makes me feel very strange. I sleep too much and cannot think clearly. Margaret seems kind, but I've noticed she watches me closely when I take the medicine. I've seen her give the same thing to other residents. Several of them have died. I wonder if there's a connection." Mrs. Whitfield had been watching and writing. Her confusion hadn't blinded her. It had sharpened her awareness in subtle ways. The Porters, so used to victims slipping into fog and silence, had overlooked her clarity. Worse, these letters, if found by anyone else, could be used as evidence. They would expose everything. Panic set in. Dr. Porter made a fateful decision. Mrs. Whitfield's death would have to be accelerated, but in doing so they crossed into dangerous territory, because rushing the process meant abandoning the precision and slow pace that had protected them for years. And for the first time, they were no longer in control. The Porters had made a mistake. In their rush to eliminate Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, they'd abandoned their own golden rule subtlety. The rapid increase in her morphine dosage had triggered exactly what they had hoped to avoid: a spectacle. She became violently ill, exhibiting symptoms far more dramatic than a gentle decline. It was no longer a graceful slipping away. It was poisoning, and it was obvious. Other residents noticed. Some whispered in fear. And more importantly, staff began to ask questions. Margaret Porter found herself walking a tightrope, soothing the staff with rehearsed lies, while continuing to administer the very drugs that were killing Mrs. Whitfield. She insisted the elderly woman had developed a rare and aggressive form of dementia, one that caused sudden violent episodes and confusion. The morphine, she said, was necessary to prevent harm, A mercy, not a crime. But then came the moment that nearly collapsed their entire operation. Dr. Marcus Fleming, Mrs. Whitfield's longtime personal physician, made a surprise visit. It was supposed to be a routine check-in, a gesture of old-fashioned loyalty to a former patient. Instead, it became a turning point. Dr. Fleming found Mrs. Whitfield in a state that shocked him. She was barely conscious, heavily sedated, and clearly deteriorating. To Dr. Fleming, who had known her for years, this was not the same woman. His examination revealed severe dehydration, dilated pupils, a dangerously irregular heartbeat. These were not signs of dementia. They were the signs of drug intoxication. When he confronted Dr. Porter, the explanation came fast and full of righteous indignation. Her condition has worsened rapidly, Porter said. We've been forced to administer more aggressive treatments. You wouldn't understand. You've been retired too long. But Dr. Fleming wasn't buying it. He pressed further, asking for a review of her medical records. And that finally shook the Porters. Margaret's falsified records were designed to justify a murder, not withstand scrutiny from a trained eye. They were full of inconsistencies, invented symptoms, and medication logs that didn't match observed outcomes. And now, for the first time, the Porters found themselves in an impossible position, defending their lies to someone who knew the truth. The confrontation that followed took place in Dr. Porter's office with Margaret and Sarah present. The tension was thick, the air heavy with unsaid threats. Dr. Fleming was calm but relentless. He dissected every aspect of Mrs. Whitfield's treatment. Her sudden sedation, the unreported changes in condition, the shocking dosages of morphine, and most damning of all, he asked the question that exposed the heart of the deception. Why wasn't her family notified of her rapid decline? Dr. Porter, sensing the walls closing in, launched into a masterclass in manipulation. He framed Dr. Fleming as outdated, unable to understand modern geriatric medicine. He invoked recent medical literature claiming Sunset Years was at the forefront of innovative elder care. He emphasized his legal and moral obligation to make the best decisions for his patients. And then he played his final card. Porter leaned forward, voice low but firm. Mrs. Whitfield told me she wanted peace. She asked me specifically to ease her suffering. She was ready to meet the Lord. He described the morphine not as treatment, but as palliative care, a spiritual gift, a merciful transition into the next life. It was the kind of explanation that fit perfectly with the home's Christian image. For a moment, Dr. Fleming hesitated. How could he argue against a dying woman's final wish? To continue pressing the issue now might make him look heartless, even cruel. He reluctantly accepted Porter's explanation, but not without warning. He made it clear he would be watching. "I'll be back," he said, "and I expect to see her improving, or I'll take further action." For the first time in over a decade, the Porters had not only been questioned, but cornered. They had escaped this confrontation by the thinnest of margins. But the threat wasn't gone. It was growing, and Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield was still alive. Dr. Marcus Fleming didn't walk away, shaken by what he'd seen in Mrs. Whitfield. He returned the next day, and the next after that. He arranged to visit her twice weekly, demanding full transparency from the staff and requesting detailed reports on her condition and treatment. It was something the Porters had never dealt with before. They weren't used to being watched. This level of scrutiny created a logistical nightmare. The morphine dosages had to be reduced. Their original murder plan had to be put on hold. And worst of all, they had to allow Mrs. Whitfield to start recovering just enough to buy time. But time was dangerous now. Every additional day she lived increased the risk that she or Dr. Fleming would uncover more of the truth. It was Sarah Porter who proposed a terrifying solution, one that marked a turning point in the evolution of their crimes. What if she asked Dr. Fleming had an accident? She had already studied his daily routine. Every morning he walked alone to his office, passing through a construction site on Beecham Street. A narrow walkway, scaffolding, loose bricks, unstable platforms, a fall, some debris. Nothing too suspicious, Sarah said. The implications were horrifying. They weren't just targeting the elderly anymore. They were now plotting the murder of a respected physician, someone young, capable, and likely to be missed. It was a line they hadn't yet crossed. But the fact they could consider it at all meant they had already lost any remaining sense of morality. Dr. Porter eventually rejected the plan, but not because of ethics. He feared the attention such a death would bring. A doctor dies, he warned, and the whole town wants answers. Worse, any investigation might dig deeper than expected, straight into their operation. Instead, he proposed something more elegant, more manipulative, and just as deadly. They wouldn't kill Dr. Fleming. They would fool him. Over the next several days, the Porters carefully adjusted their plan. Mrs. Whitfield's morphine was gradually tapered off, allowing her to regain just enough strength and lucidity to appear stable. But behind the scenes, Dr. Porter began administering small doses of a different drug, one that would mimic the symptoms of heart disease. By the time Dr. Fleming arrived for his next visit, he was surprised but relieved to find Mrs. Whitfield improved. Her confusion had diminished. The dangerous symptoms had vanished, but now new signs had appeared. An irregular heartbeat, shortness of breath, general fatigue. Dr. Porter explained that these symptoms were a new development and that he had already begun treatment using digitalis, a common drug for heart conditions. He also credited Dr. Fleming for the change. Your concerns prompted us to reevaluate everything, he said warmly. Her improvement is a result of your wise counsel. It was a performance so smooth, so strategically rehearsed, that even the suspicious Dr. Fleming let his guard down. He was grateful, even impressed. He agreed to reduce his visits to once a week. More importantly, he left believing that Mrs. Whitfield was safe. But nothing could be further from the truth. Unbeknownst to him, the Porters had merely changed methods. The digitalis, supposedly administered as treatment, was being given in steadily increasing doses. Over the course of 6 weeks, it would weaken her heart, mimic natural decline, and eventually stop it entirely. It was a slower death, but a perfectly undetectable one. And when Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield finally passed, it was in her bed, peaceful, quiet. Dr. Fleming was there. He held her hand. He closed her eyes, and he signed the death certificate without hesitation. noting that her passing was consistent with age-related cardiac failure. The Porters had done it again. They had murdered their most dangerous victim right under the nose of the one man who might have saved her. And worse still, they had convinced him he'd helped. This victory gave the Porters a terrifying new confidence. They now believed no one could stop them, not doctors, not families, not priests, not even God. The Porters had done the impossible. They had proven they could adapt to any challenge, outmaneuver any threat, and deceive even the most experienced professionals. The death of Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield had not just been their most profitable murder, it had been their most complex. The $200,000 they siphoned from her estate funded the next chapter in their criminal empire, allowing them to expand their operations far beyond what they'd ever imagined. But buried within their secret ledgers, hidden beneath the chapel floorboards, was something far more disturbing than the financial figure's pride. Dr. William Porter had begun documenting each murder like a surgeon preparing a case study, or worse, a mathematician solving elegant puzzles. Every complication, every adaptation, every lie that worked. His entries read like twisted academic journals, filled with notes on dosages, psychological manipulation, and legal maneuvering. What had once been opportunistic cruelty had now evolved into something colder, smarter, and far more dangerous. A system of death so refined, so justified, so profitable. They believed it would never be stopped. By 1865, the Porters had been killing for over 20 years. The end of the Civil War brought fresh victims into their orbit, aging veterans wounded and alone carried home from the battlefield, with pensions in their pockets and no families to return to. The Porters saw in them the perfect prey, men with honor, men with dignity, men whose deaths would be seen as sad but expected. And among these men was one who would change everything. Captain Ezra Blackwood arrived at Sunset Years in the spring of 1866. He was 62, a former Union Army officer, and a survivor of Gettysburg. He'd lost his left arm to cannon shrapnel and lived with constant pain. But beneath the injury, beneath the pain, was steel. Captain Blackwood had no wife, no children. He carried a substantial pension and a private savings account that made him a target the Porters couldn't resist. But there was something about him they didn't account for. He paid attention. Years of military command had trained him to notice details, deception, and danger. And from the moment he entered the Sunset Years Christian home, he knew something wasn't right. Blackwood watched. He saw that new residents, many in fair health, declined rapidly after arriving. He noticed that Dr. Porter's care involved more questions about wills and finances than about physical ailments. He observed that Margaret administered medications more often than necessary, and that those same medications made residents sleepier, slower, and less likely to speak up. Even more chilling was the realization that the home's mortality rate was unusually high, shockingly so given its spotless reputation. So the captain did what any seasoned commander would do. He went to war quietly, He began an investigation. He kept detailed notes in a personal ledger. He charted the names of the dead, the dates, the symptoms. He watched how often Dr. Porter visited certain rooms before a death, and he talked, not to staff, but to other residents, asking them subtle questions. Many couldn't remember their medications. Some said they felt confused, but weren't sure why. Others had simply given up, and then the captain realized he too was starting to slip. Dr. Porter had prescribed laudanum for his pain, a common opiate used frequently at the time. But the captain began to notice changes, sudden confusion, blurred vision, a creeping sense of disconnection from reality. He had spent too long on the battlefield to miss the signs of poisoning, so he made a decision that may have saved his life. He began to hide his medication. Instead of swallowing the bitter tincture, he stored the doses in his drawer, and day by day, as his mind cleared, his resolve hardened. Something criminal was happening at the Sunset Years Christian home. He was sure of it now, but he still didn't know just how deep the rot ran. And the Porters, they had no idea their next victim had become their most dangerous enemy. Captain Ezra Blackwood had become more than just a problem for the Porters. He had become a threat, a thinking, calculating, and organized threat. His refusal to take Dr. Porter's prescribed medications meant he was alert, clear-minded, and dangerously aware. Without the usual fog of laudanum or morphine, the captain's sharp instincts remained intact and sharpened by suspicion. Dr. Porter attempted persuasion. He warned Blackwood that without proper medication, his injuries would worsen. But the captain remained firm. "I felt better every day since I stopped listening to you," he reportedly said, locking eyes with Porter in quiet defiance. What made Captain Blackwood so dangerous wasn't just his clarity of mind, but his ability to inspire others. He began speaking carefully with other residents, only those who seemed lucid aware and capable of discretion. He didn't accuse the Porters outright. Instead, he asked questions. "Have you noticed a change in your medicine? Did the doctor ever ask about your will? Have you seen others decline too fast?" It started with whispers. Then it became a network. Before long, Captain Blackwood had built a small resistance movement inside the very walls of Sunset Years, a rebellion of the forgotten, quietly pushing back against their would-be executioners. And the Porters took notice. The full scope of Blackwood's threat was revealed when Margaret Porter intercepted a letter addressed to his former commanding officer in Washington. In it, Captain Blackwood detailed his suspicions about unnatural deaths, his theory about the manipulation of wills, a list of victims, descriptions of medications being administered without clear cause. The letter wasn't a theory. It was a dossier. Evidence, names, dates, and most importantly, it was on its way to someone who had the authority and resources to take action. To the Porters, it was a ticking bomb. Dr. Porter immediately understood Blackwood had to die. But this was no ordinary resident. They couldn't sedate him, he was too suspicious. They couldn't poison him, he wasn't taking anything. And they couldn't risk a sudden death. As a decorated war hero with military connections, any fatal incident would trigger an investigation at the federal level. They needed something different, something that looked like an accident, something that blamed his war wounds, not them. Sarah Porter proposed a chilling solution. They would stage a fatal fall down the home's grand staircase. Blame it on his missing arm. Call it a tragic accident, another wounded veteran taken too soon by the limitations of his broken body. The plan required perfect timing. On a stormy night, rain hammering the windows and staff preoccupied with leaks and alarms, Dr. Porter approached Blackwood's room with a loaded syringe, a powerful sedative meant to render the captain unconscious. But what he found inside was not a helpless old man. It was a soldier, waiting in ambush. Blackwood was behind the door. When Porter entered, the captain struck him with a heavy walking stick, knocking the syringe from his hand. The two men struggled, but Blackwood's military training kicked in. He forced Dr. Porter out of the room, bloody and bruised. And now, there were no more doubts. Captain Blackwood knew. He had been right all along. And now the Porters knew that he knew. Any reasonable man would have fled. But Blackwood wasn't just thinking of himself. He knew that escape wouldn't stop the killings. If he disappeared, the Porters would simply resume their operation, refining their methods, learning from their mistakes, and destroying more lives. No, he wouldn't run. Not yet. He made a decision that would define his legacy. He would stay. He would gather irrefutable proof, the kind no one could deny. He would expose the truth, even if it cost him his life. Because Captain Ezra Blackwood was no ordinary resident. He was a warrior. And this home, once meant to be a sanctuary, had become his final battlefield. Captain Ezra Blackwood had crafted a soldier's plan for a silent war. His mission obtained physical proof, vials, labels, ledgers, records, anything that could expose the true nature of Sunset Year's Christian home. Using skills honed in wartime reconnaissance, he moved through the building with stealth-searching locked offices, memorizing guard rotations, documenting what others had never dared to question. And what he found in Dr. Porter's private office was worse than even he had feared. Behind rows of dusty medical volumes, tucked behind an anatomy atlas and a copy of the New Testament, Blackwood discovered a trove of horror. Vials of morphine, arsenic, and unlabeled chemical compounds, none of which had legitimate purpose in elder care. A folder of blank death certificates and forged wills, many partially completed, and a typed list of deceased residents, each name followed by a dollar amount, an itemized inventory of human lives, turned into profit. This was no longer suspicion. This was a death ledger. Captain Blackwood worked quickly. He used a compact camera standard military intelligence equipment to photograph everything. He documented vial labels, handwritten notes, even the angle of drawers and the positions of books. Every detail mattered. His plan was clear. Deliver the evidence to federal military authorities. Let them investigate. Let them dismantle this nest of evil from the top down. But fate intervened. As the captain loaded his final roll of film, Sarah Porter entered the office. She froze when she saw him, camera in hand desk drawer, open files exposed. The confrontation that followed was not filled with panic. There was no yelling, no scrambling for excuses. Captain Blackwood simply stood tall. "It's over," he said. "I've already sent everything I need to the War Department. You kill me. Now, you only seal your fate." His voice was calm, certain. A commander at the end of a long campaign. Sarah Porter stared at him, shaken, not just by his words, but by the inevitability in them. This wasn't a confused old man. This was a trained military officer who had planned for his own death and accounted for it. For the first time in 20 years, the Porters faced an enemy they could not outwit, bribe, or sedate. Dr. Porter burst into the room moments later. When he saw the camera, the scattered files, and Blackwood standing his ground, he understood. The home had been breached not by outside investigators, but from within, by a resident who had seen through every lie. They were exposed, and in that moment, the mask fell away. Dr. Porter reached into his desk and retrieved a pistol. Margaret screamed. 3 shots echoed through the house like thunder from a coming storm. Captain Ezra Blackwood, Union Army veteran, Gettysburg survivor. The last hope for justice collapsed to the floor. The silence that followed was brief. Residents screamed. Staff ran toward the sound. Margaret arrived first, followed by a dozen horrified onlookers. Dr. Porter, blood on his collar and madness in his eyes, tried one last desperate performance. "He attacked me," he gasped. "He went mad. I had no choice." But the room told a different story. The gun had been fired at close range. There were no signs of struggle on the captain's body. The camera lay beside him, shattered, but still clutching rolls of exposed film, and scattered across the desk, documents that no one could explain away. Dosage charts, forged wills, a partial confession typed by Sarah, notes written in Dr. Porter's own hand, amount secured $200,000, method digitalis. There would be no more cover-ups, no prayers to veil their crimes, no God left in this house. For the first time since 1847, the Porters had committed a crime so public, so undeniable, that no performance could save them. Captain Blackwood's body lay where he fell. But his mission was complete. He had not survived the war, but he had ended one. And the fall of the Porter Empire had finally begun. The gunshots that ended Captain Ezra Blackwood's life did more than echo through the halls of the Sunset Years Christian home. They pierced the illusion. Within hours, Hartford police arrived to investigate what neighbors had reported as a violent incident. The Porters, ever the performers, put on their most practiced expressions of sorrow and concern. They told investigators that Captain Blackwood had suffered from war-related madness, that the shooting had been a tragic accident, that they were heartbroken. But the facade cracked quickly. In Dr. Porter's office, hidden behind shelves of religious texts and antique ledgers, police found everything. The pistol still warm, vials of morphine arsenic digitalis, forged wills, half-filled death certificates, and most damning of all, Captain Blackwood's camera film still inside, and a notebook detailing 2 decades of quiet slaughter. The evidence laid out a roadmap. It was systematic murder, theft, and fraud, all masked behind the veil of Christian mercy. Hartford police launched the most extensive criminal investigation in the city's history. Search teams combed the facility from attic to basement. They uncovered false patient records, secret caches of poisons, hidden financial ledgers, meticulously recording every stolen dollar and every silenced resident. And then came the ledgers. Dr. Porter's personal records hidden under floorboards in a locked drawer. There, it was a confessional archive of murder written in the doctor's own hand. As word of the investigation spread, families across Connecticut began to come forward. Daughters, nephews, estranged siblings, all suddenly questioning the strange, quiet deaths of their loved ones. What emerged was a pattern of horror. The residents had all been wealthy, isolated, elderly, and in the care of devout Christians who had praised God as they poisoned them. The Porters were arrested on charges of 189 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of fraud, and conspiracy. Even then, they denied everything, claimed they were victims of a delusional war veteran. But Hartford was no longer fooled. October 15, 1879, the trial of Dr. William Porter, Margaret Porter, and Sarah Porter began. The Hartford Courant called it the most sensational criminal proceeding in the history of Connecticut. The courtroom overflowed with spectators, families of victims clutching handkerchiefs and photographs, journalists from New York, Boston, even London, townspeople who had once shaken hands with the Porters after Sunday service. The atmosphere in the courthouse was thick with grief and fury, and at times the judge had to bang his gavel just to keep order. Prosecutor James Mitchell led the case. His foundation, Captain Blackwood's evidence, the poisons and forged documents, and witnesses, former staff, who finally stepped forward to describe what they had seen. But the most damning exhibit was the ledgers. Dr. Porter, ever meticulous, had recorded every detail: name, date, poison used, inheritance value, time required, profit earned. The courtroom fell silent as excerpts were read aloud. Mrs. Sarah Caldwell, arsenic administered over 6 weeks, symptoms consistent with natural decline, will forged successfully, inheritance $67,400, time investment 8 weeks, profit per week $8,125, excellent return on effort. These weren't the words of a healer. They were the calculations of a predator. Each entry revealed more than a crime. It revealed a cold business, profitability ratings, difficulty scores, Margaret's performance reviews during fake grieving episodes, notes like Sarah's tearful delivery of bequest letter well received. Consider replicating approach. The Porters had industrialized death, and what disturbed the court most was not only the magnitude of the crimes, it was that the Porters had enjoyed it. If you're feeling chills right now, share this story with someone who appreciates the darkest corners of forgotten history. Hit like to help support our channel. Subscribe so you never miss another mystery. And stay with us, because the trial has only just begun. What punishment can truly measure justice? For 189 stolen lives, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence as the prosecution unveiled some of the most haunting lines ever written in a medical journal. Not from a researcher, not from a philosopher, but from a killer in a white coat. Subject exhibited amusing confusion during final days. Margaret's tears on command remain an excellent technique for deflecting suspicion. Spiritual consolation enhanced performance. Resident expired peacefully. Inheritance secured. These were the words of Dr. William Porter, recorded in his own hand, entry after entry, life after life, reduced to columns of symptoms, spiritual theater, and profit margins. The prosecution then called Dr. Samuel Harrison Hartford's longtime coroner. He took the stand with visible bitterness in his voice. Years earlier, he had tried to sound the alarm, had raised questions about the home's abnormally high death rate and the suspicious frequency with which Dr. Porter signed death certificates. But his concerns had been silenced. The Porters, cloaked in Christian reputation and supported by powerful donors, had evaded scrutiny. "We could have stopped this," Dr. Harrison said. But no one wanted to believe that kindness could be a mask. Then came the witnesses from within. Nurse Elizabeth Hartwell testified that she had seen Margaret Porter administer large doses of morphine at irregular times, often late at night when no one else was watching. She had overheard conversations between the Porters about financial records, family estrangements, and timelines. Groundskeeper Thomas Murphy described even stranger sights: late-night burials in the garden, ashes in the furnace that looked like legal documents, a locked shed that no one but Sarah Porter had a key to. They weren't caretakers. They were curators of death. The defense was desperate. Led by prominent attorney Charles Whitman, their only option was to claim insanity, specifically a shared religious mania. Whitman argued that the Porters were not cold-blooded killers, but delusional prophets, that they had genuinely believed they were doing God's work. He brought in doctors alienists, the 19th century term for psychiatrists who testified that the Porters exhibited symptoms of religious psychosis. They saw themselves as chosen, said one expert. As executors of divine justice, it was a bold strategy. And it forced the Porters to do something they hadn't done in 20 years. Confess. Dr. William Porter took the stand first. He admitted to dozens of murders, calmly, clinically explaining his methods, like he was teaching a class. "God called me to end their suffering," he said. "It was not killing. It was mercy. It was stewardship of the soul." There was no remorse in his voice, no tremble in his hands. Then came Margaret Porter. She described her role not as a nurse, but as a priestess of peace. "I prayed over each of them," she said. "I asked God to forgive them. I held their hands while they passed." It was beautiful. Courtroom spectators gasped. Some cried. Others walked out. Sarah Porter, the most calculating of the three, confessed to forgery, financial theft, and manipulation of probate law. But she too insisted she was guided by heaven. "Wealth left to the greedy is wasted," she declared. "We returned it to God's purpose. We redistributed His blessings." She described her selection process, researching family connections, inheritance laws, and spiritual readiness. It was a system, and in her mind, it was holy. But the prosecution wasn't finished. Prosecutor Mitchell stood and calmly dismantled the defense. He pointed to the hidden poisons, the forged documents, the elaborate deception that spanned decades, and above all, the efforts to evade detection. These were not the actions of the insane, Mitchell said. These were the actions of people who knew what they were doing and wanted to get away with it. He quoted from Dr. Porter's own journal. Self-preservation requires disposal of inquisitive parties. Threat level high. Proceed with caution. No one suffering divine delusions writes that. That is a man managing a criminal enterprise. As the courtroom waited for the verdict, one question remained. Could anyone still believe the Porters were simply mad, or had the trial exposed what they truly were evil? In the guise of grace, the end of the Porters, and the legacy of Hartford's Chamber of Horrors. The courtroom fell utterly silent as Prosecutor Mitchell read the final entry from Dr. Porter's private ledger. 20 years of successful operations have proven the viability of our method. We have perfected the art of profitable death, combining religious respectability with systematic exploitation. Our victims die believing they are loved, while we acquire the wealth to expand our sacred mission. God has blessed our work with remarkable success. We are prepared to continue indefinitely. Note: consider expansion to other cities. Hartford market becoming saturated. Gasps echoed through the room. A woman screamed. A man lunged toward the defendants before being restrained by deputies. Judge Morrison banged his gavel furiously, calling for order. But no one in that courtroom would ever forget the sound of evil masquerading as sanctity. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges after just 3 hours of deliberation. When the verdicts were read, none of the Porters showed emotion. Not a tremble, not a tear. Just the same chilling detachment that had defined their crimes. Judge Morrison then pronounced sentence, death by hanging, for all 3, and then, with righteous fury, he delivered words that seemed to pierce the very soul of the courtroom. You have blasphemed against the very faith you claim to serve. You used the sacred trust of Christian charity to commit acts of unparalleled evil. You did not merely take lives. You corrupted something people believed was holy. The trial had stripped away every illusion. The charity events, recruiting grounds for victims, the Christian mission, a mask for greed, the care facility, a machine of murder, optimized, industrialized, and cloaked in prayer. Investigators discovered 189 confirmed victims. But some believe the true number is far higher, possibly over 300. Some records were burned. Some families never came forward. And some deaths were just too well disguised. On the morning of June 4th, 1880, the Porters were hanged at the Connecticut State Prison. They died as they had lived side by side, unrepentant, detached, utterly convinced that they had been right. Witnesses reported that Margaret sang a hymn quietly as the noose was tightened. Sarah held a crucifix, and Dr. Porter whispered, "Into thy hands, O Lord." None expressed remorse. The Sunset Years Christian home was shut down permanently. Its building was later demolished and the land left untouched. two stained locals said to be built on again. To this day, the case of the Porters remains one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, a story not just of murder, but of trust, betrayed faith, weaponized, and the terrifying truth that evil sometimes wears the face of virtue. If this story shook you, like it did us, share it with a friend who loves chilling forgotten history. Hit like to help others discover the horrifying truth of Hartford's most deadly deception. And subscribe to Sleepy History Tales, where we uncover the darkest shadows of the past, one forgotten horror at a time. Want the full series of America's hidden murder institutions? Comment below with more dark charities and we'll go deeper. Until then, sleep well if you can. The aftermath of the Porter executions and the legacy no one wanted. As the nooses tightened and the trapdoors dropped at exactly 7:00 a.m. on December 15th, 1879, Hartford witnessed the end of the most cold-blooded family enterprise in American history, the executions of Dr. William Porter. Margaret Porter and Sarah Porter were carried out simultaneously in the courtyard of the Hartford County Jail, while a stunned crowd of hundreds gathered outside in the winter morning mist. But even as they faced death, the Porters showed no remorse. Dr. Porter turned to the gathered officials and journalists with a chilling declaration: "We have served God faithfully. We go to our reward, knowing that our work has been misunderstood by those who lack the vision to see divine purpose in earthly suffering. History will vindicate our actions." Margaret's final words were equally disturbing. "I have eased the suffering of 189 souls. Each death was an act of love, a gift to the dying, and Sarah silent to the very end." Until she whispered softly as the trap opened, "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." None of them repented. None asked forgiveness. They died believing they were saints, not serial killers. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in Hartford's Potter's Field. No cemetery would take them. No church would bless them. No stone bears their names. The city of Hartford made it clear there would be no shrine, no legend, no martyrdom. But the terror didn't die with them. The financial investigation that followed was massive. Authorities ultimately confirmed that the Porters had stolen $3.2 million, equivalent to over 100 million in today's money. Some of it funded the expansion of the Sunset Years Christian home. Some went into luxury items, jewelry, imported furnishings, expensive garments, and disturbingly, some of it was donated to churches and charities across Connecticut. The revelation that blood money had funded pulpits, stained glass, and Sunday schools sent shockwaves through Hartford's religious institutions. Some churches returned the funds in shame. Others wrestled publicly and painfully with the moral cost of doing good with evil money. The Porters had exploited not only the vulnerable, but the sacred. They understood one truth better than anyone else: that America trusts its institutions and especially its religious ones. And they used that trust as their most potent weapon. They didn't just kill 189 people. They turned Christian compassion into a mask for systematic murder. They ran death as a business with ledgers and prophets' prayers and poison. And for 20 years they got away with it. The case led to sweeping reforms, mandatory coroner reviews of deaths in care facilities, stricter oversight of religious charities, and a new awareness that even the most trusted institutions must be held accountable. Legacy of the Porters. A crime that changed a nation. The fallout from the Porter case didn't end with the executions. The scandal split Hartford's religious community for years. Churches that had once praised the Porters for their charity now faced public shame for accepting donations funded by murder. The city introduced new laws requiring detailed documentation of large religious contributions. The betrayal of Christian trust had become a national conversation, and as for the Sunset Years Christian Home, in the spring of 1880, the building was demolished not due to decay, but because the city declared it too infamous to serve any moral purpose. Modest homes were built on the property, but the stain remained. For decades, property values in the area were low, and those who lived there often whispered that something still lingered an unease that no foundation could cover up. But what the Porters left behind wasn't just death. It was a legacy of reform. Regulations were rewritten. Connecticut introduced the first comprehensive oversight laws for charitable institutions. Other states followed. Inspections, background checks, and medical record requirements became the new standard for elder care. Inheritance laws were also transformed. New rules were passed to verify wills, confirm mental competence, and flag suspicious donations to private facilities or religious organizations. No one would ever again so easily poison, forge, and steal under the guise of mercy. But the emotional toll on Hartford was deeper than laws could fix. Neighbors, churchgoers, doctors, all forced to ask, how could we have trusted them? Dr. Samuel Harrison, the coroner, who once tried to raise alarms, spent the rest of his life reforming medical ethics, training future doctors to spot signs of institutional abuse. His efforts helped birth modern forensic death investigations. Former staff members of the home, many of whom had no idea what they were part of, struggled with guilt. Some left healthcare forever. Others required therapy to cope with the realization that they had unknowingly assisted murderers. Families of the victims experienced a haunting mix of grief, regret, and rage. Support groups formed among the first organized victims' advocacy networks in the country. The Porter trial also changed American journalism. For the first time, reporters from multiple cities covered a single criminal case, setting the standard for true crime coverage. Books followed quickly, and the Porters became one of the earliest and darkest figures in American true crime literature. Churches across the country turned the story into sermons. They warned of false prophets, of wolves in shepherd's clothing. The message was clear. Even the most sacred spaces can hide monsters, and even buildings couldn't escape the shadow. The destruction of the Porter home set a national precedent. When places become synonymous with evil, they must be erased. No monuments, no shrines, no excuses. Today, the Porter case is still taught in criminology classes for its psychological insights, medical ethics programs for its warnings about unchecked authority, and legal seminars on the dangers of exploiting the vulnerable. The Porters didn't just kill. They perfected the business of death, masked behind Christian respectability. They operated for 20 years, committed 189 proven murders, and stole over 3.2 million dios. They prayed over the bodies, and they kept ledgers as if this was just another business. Their story is a reminder that evil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it wears a cross and calls itself your caregiver. So what do you think? Do you believe we know the full truth about the Porters? Or do you think there were more victims, more crimes that went undiscovered? The precision of their records suggests completeness. But could some secrets have died with them? Share your theories in the comments below. Like this video if the Porters made your skin crawl. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another dark and twisted tale from Sleepy History Tales. And share this story with someone who still believes it couldn't happen here.